What we have seen is a difference in the distribution of locations of where tornadoes are forming and the time of year that tornadoes are occurring.
So how is a tornado formed?
That's a really good question, and we don't actually know all of the gory details, but in principle what happens is we have rotation that gets developed at the ground, and then we have a thunderstorm that's kind of overhead of that ground-based rotation, and what happens is the rotation that's below is sucked into the middle and pulled upward, very similar to an ice skater. As she pulls her arms in, she spins faster.
So when it, like the ground-based rotation, if I understand this correct, so like the tornado doesn't start rotating at the top and then go down to the ground, it starts at the ground and then goes up?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's actually a misnomer. Like our eyes cue into the funnel cloud, and obviously the funnel cloud develops in the sky and then works its way down. But in order to actually have a full-fledged tornado, you need to have that ground-based rotation present in the first place. So oftentimes what we end up seeing happen is we see that rotation start to organize at the ground, and then it intensifies in the storm above, and that intensification in the storm above at the same time as that intensification of the ground-based rotation essentially works together to kind of complete almost like a rotational circuit, if you would.
Climate change, has that affected them in the sense of their strength? There's more of them, they're in different places, or?
Yeah, so putting the climate change piece to tornadoes is challenging because, as we've discussed already, tornadoes are very sensitive to very localized conditions. So you can't attribute ever any individual tornado event to climate change. What we can do is try to assess the impact that climate change has on the larger scale environment and whether or not that is supportive or not supportive moving forward with time. So based upon the data that we have from 1990 to present, there has not been any kind of significant increase in the number of tornadoes on any given year when you look at the full course of that time frame. Neither has there been an increase in intensity of tornadoes. What we do see is a little bit of an increase in low-end tornadoes, so EF0s and EF1s, and that again is primarily a function of our ability to see those areas of rotation using the radar data and saying like, oh, we see rotation there. The National Weather Service warned for that tornado. Did something happen? And there's incentive from the NWS. They want to verify their warnings, right? So they are going to make phone calls. They're going to send somebody out to see if that area of rotation that they warned for actually indeed did produce a tornado. So we do see a little bit of an increase in numbers there, but that again is probably non-physical in the sense that like those numbers were probably always the same moving back into history. We just are better equipped to observe those tornadoes now. What we have seen is a difference in the distribution of locations of where tornadoes are forming and the time of year that tornadoes are occurring. So in a very traditional sense, Tornado Alley, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, has always been the mecca for tornadoes in the US and in the world. And it still is. I don't want to slight them from that. But we are seeing a significant decline in the number of tornadoes in that part of the country. And we think that's primarily driven by drought and the fact that in a climate change scenario, we're increasing the robustness of the hydrological cycle. And we tend to be seeing more drought in areas like Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. And where you have drought, you have dry conditions, you have dry soils. And that's going to be negatively impacting the ability of the atmosphere to actually produce a tornado. So we do see a little bit of a decline in the number of tornadoes in those traditional states, particularly in the climatologically most active months of the year, primarily like late April or early, well, all of May basically, and into early June. Now, to compensate for that, what we are seeing is an increase in the number of tornadoes in southeastern states of the United States. And this is kind of the traditional Dixie Alley that people refer to. So we're looking at Mississippi and Alabama, into Georgia and Tennessee. And I don't like to call it a shift because it's not like a continuous thing. It's not like the tornadoes are kind of like starting here and they're edging this way, but instead it's kind of like a reallocation. Like we're kind of reducing the numbers here, but we're adding to the numbers here in a sort of different spatial sense. And those tornadoes are occurring during the cold season. So January, February, March, times of year when we as people tend to not think about tornadoes as being overly important because it's wintertime, right? But the link there is retaining heat in the Gulf of Mexico, and then the conflict with the cold air that still is generated in polar latitudes. When you have these really strong cold fronts come through, you have really cold air aloft, and then you generate these very strong and dynamically driven low pressure systems. So these are basically your everyday lows, like where you have a cold front and a warm front and drive our everyday weather. In this climate change scenario, those become almost a little bit more robust because we have more heat and more energy stored up in the Gulf of Mexico to contribute to moving on land as that large-scale low-pressure system is intensifying. And then that can cause destabilization and can cause these really deep low pressures that ultimately drive large-scale environmental conditions that are favorable for tornadoes.
Why does it seem to be only in certain places, only at certain times?
That has to do with the physical geographic configuration of that part of the country. We have a warm, moist source for air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. We have elevated terrain towards the west. That includes both the Colorado Rockies. So we get low pressure systems developing on the eastern side of those Colorado Rockies, which promote southerly winds, which suck up that warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. And then further to the southwest, we have a geographic feature called the Mexican Plateau, which advects or moves air from the southwest towards the northeast, which trajectory-wise takes it up over the Central Plains area, and that contributes to the formation of a feature known as the dry line. And the dry line is a known source for forming storms in the first place. And then that air also actually contributes to a stable layer immediately above the ground, which allows for the surface conditions to become really juicy and moist and wet and warm. And eventually, once it gets warm enough, we can have explosive thunderstorm development. So without that stable layer above, we would see more modest kind of trickling of intermediate type thunderstorms. When we look at specific locations, like a specific town or a specific area near a mountain, for example, we do know that in some cases, depending on the overall larger scale environment, we can locally contribute to environments that are more favorable for tornado formation because of specific geographic features that exist at an exact location. So for example, there are certain river valleys that are known to change the winds in a manner that actually creates tornadoes more efficiently than if those river valleys weren't there, for example. Similarly, there's some terrain features, for example, in Alabama, where we tend to see enhanced tornado formation on one side or the other side of a topographic feature. And again, we relate that to local modification, primarily of wind direction and wind speed, that for basically a short time frame as a storm is passing over it, locally enhances the environmental conditions and essentially tips the scale toward a scenario that's more favorable for tornadoes than if that terrain feature weren't there in the first place.
When you talk about like terrain features, right? Like the first thing, are we talking about like, okay, we built this row of houses in a way that funnels the wind? Are we talking about like golf courses, or like we've tunneled into the side of a mountain or something? Like what do you mean by like topographical features?
So I basically mean kind of the natural features in the land. So hills and valleys and to a degree some smaller mountains. And now if you have a really large mountain, typically that's not going to be favorable for a tornado to survive. It's not going to be able to go up and over. But certain smaller scale hills and escarpments or valleys are known to locally modify the direction and speed of winds in that sense.